Today we will discuss about role of remote sensing and GIS techniques in disaster management mitigation measures under the program of training and awareness program. So before we start with disaster management, so we have to define what is disaster. Disaster is something a sudden or unexpected event or a series of events that happen which actually have a very serious impact on the infrastructure, population, economy and damage the property and the environment. So these disasters are more common in the current scenario because of the climate change conditions. Climate change triggering different kinds of disasters. We can classify disasters as a natural and the man-made. So mostly what are the disasters we see are currently are the natural disasters like tsunami, volcanic activity, flooding, cyclone. While sometimes the accident that happens because of the nuclear accidents is a human based thing, or sometimes there may be fires within a building that is also triggered by the human activities. But again we have the wildfires which are actually a part of the natural disasters. So either it is a natural or it is a by the human beings man-made. These disasters they has an impact on the property, especially on the population and the livelihood of the people. So now there is a need to understand these disasters, and because these disasters are inevitable, because we don't know at what time, at what pace these disasters may happen. So there is a need for having some kind of understanding such that we come up with some kind of a mitigation program or some kind of the assessment that helps us to reduce the damage that can happen because of these disasters. So a study by United Nations which actually shows the different types of disasters, like we have drought, we have the flooding, we have different kinds of disasters. Over time they observed that from 1990 to 1999 and 2000 to 2009 in a decadal areas time periods, there is an actually you can see the big circles indicating that there is a too much of the this is a flooding scenarios. So the flooding that happened between 1990 to 1999, the events of the flooding are actually almost increased in between the 2000 to 2009. And similarly we have the different kinds of disasters ultimately increase. So they found that almost 83% increase in these kind of disasters, and almost there is a double of these disasters over time, and this typically because of the climate change conditions which actually creating such kind of disasters. When you talk about the disasters, we need to understand these disasters. There is a possibility that there are some traditional methods to understand, but currently we have geospatial technology which actually encompasses remote sensing, geographical information system and the GPS. So an integration of these geospatial technology typically helps us in understanding how to address these disasters, how to understand these disasters, how to manage these disasters. So basically two technologies are currently useful in a wider way. One is the remote sensing process. Remote sensing, the process of obtaining information about the object without coming in contact with the object, and this information is captured by the sensor that is placed in the satellites, which is the platform. So sensors are designed with multispectral bands, and whatever the information that is captured, that is recorded by the sensors which has these different bands. So from these sensors we have the images. So if I want to understand a disaster, I can have what is the condition of the particular area before the disaster, what is the pre-disaster condition, and what is the condition of the location after the disaster. So I can make a comparison between the pre-disaster images and the post-disaster image, and I can understand what is the extent of damage that actually happened to that particular location in terms of the natural cover. And we have one more technology, the geographical information system, which actually a computer based system that actually stores the information, it analyzes the information. This system also helps us to visualize the data, and we can also model the data to see that what will happen in the future if the same kind of trend happens. So, what we call as a modeling process. So, in case of GIS, when you do the modeling process, we will make use of the input that is coming from the remote sensing platforms. It can be the satellite, or it can be coming from the aeroplane as a aerial photograph. So, we integrate image data that is coming either from these sources with the GIS components, and we try to do the modeling process to indicate that what will happen in the future if the same kind of trend is happening. We can also come up with some kind of assessment to show that where there is a more possibility of the happening this kind of disasters. So, integrating these two technologies, we create a kind of a map that helps us to say that these are the safer zones and these are the high risk prone areas. So, what is the role of remote sensing in GIS in disaster mitigation? One is the disaster mitigation. So, mitigation is something a priori I will try to come up with some kind of a solution or a method to prevent or to reduce the damage that can happen. So, we can come up with a different methodologies how to tackle the disasters. It also helps us in the risk assessment. So, now I have remote sensing and GIS data. I can make use of the historical data sets. I will try to see what is the trend in the particular features on surface of the earth, and I will do a mapping indicating that where there is a more possibility of the risk. Suppose if I am looking for some kind of a flood as a disaster. So, using the remote sensing satellite data and using the digital elevation models, which actually provides me what is the topography of the area, then I can make out a map saying that okay, these are the low areas which are more prone to such kind of flooding scenarios, while these are the areas which are something safer. So, these maps are also helps us in identifying where actually we can keep the people at a safer location, or what kind of rehabilitation things that can be happen. So, to all these things we create maps what called as a risk hazard or the hazardous map, showing that low to the maximum, low to the high risk. Then we have early warning systems. So, if I know the data coming from the satellites and also some kind of sensors that are placed in the locations. For example, if I put some kind of sensors in an area which is more prone to landslides, I can make out actually when and what time there is a possibility of this kind of landslide can occur. In addition to this kind of data, we attach with the remote sensing data that typically the land use land cover, where what is the vegetation, what is the soil, so what is the extent of the rainfall that is happening. If you gather all this information along with the sensor information, we actually create some kind of a saying that okay, these are the zones where actually there is a landslide susceptibility map, what we call as a. So, there is a possibility of the landslides. Then we provide something that okay, these are the regions where people will be having this kind of problem with the landslides, and it is easy to the evacuating. So, we create some kind of a early warning system. Something similarly for the tsunami. So, we have the tsunami triggering mechanism alarms. Then we also have the ocean buoys. Ocean buoys are the some devices that actually captures changes in the ocean parameters. So, integrating both these things, we can come up with some kind of a tsunami alerts indicating that there is a possibility of this kind of disasters where actually people can be evacuated from that places. So, the technique mainly helps us in coming up with this kind of early warning system. Since we have the historical data sets, so what is the image of particular area before the damage, and how the area changed after the damage, post the damage. We can make a comparison. We see that what is the extent of damage that happened. Then we can also look into what are the possible evacuation methods, or we come up with what is the shortest path where actually we can provide some kind of relief benefits to the people. So all such kind of assessment can be done using the technique. Emergency response planning, something evacuating the people from that location. As I mentioned, if there is a tsunami warning, so what is the best way to evacuate, because at that time possibility is that we should come up with some kind of a best way, the pathway that actually makes the people to reach to the safer place at the earliest. If there is a fire within a building, so how to evacuate the people within the building. So all this also come under the planning of emergency response planning using GIS and remote sensing technique. Then long-term recovery and the reconstruction process. So when you try to see what is the disaster happened at a particular time, and over time you check the what is the change in the historical features of that particular area, we'll try to see that whether the system is capable of regaining or recovering to the old condition, or typically what we call as a restoration method. Suppose if you look into the tsunami disaster that happened in 2004, and if we look into the islands that are more prone to or affected with the tsunami in 2004, and now currently if you have the data of the current period, almost 2 decades, then we see that whether the forest area is regained or still it is lost. Such kind of assessment can be done using the remote sensing data, as well as the reconstruction. So within an area, it can be volcanic activity problem, or it can be because of the tsunami thing. People are actually moved from that particular area to another area, what we call as a rehabilitation process, where there is a again reconstruction of their settlement areas. So which is the best location to do such kind of activities can also be done using this technique. So in this way, we have a different mechanism integrating remote sensing, GIS, coming with some kind of assessment and coming with some kind of warning systems, doing some kind of modeling, which totally helps in the resilience of the particular ecosystems. So we have GIS as a data, then which is our remote sensing data that is coming from the satellites, then integrating both, we'll try to come up with this kind of hazard risk assessment. So now we'll go with different examples where actually we can look into application of remote sensing and GIS in mitigating the disaster process. So first we have earthquakes. Earthquakes, as you know, they are the sudden and unexpected disasters which actually creates a lot of havoc and population damage, infrastructure damage. So what is the possible way to understand this disaster? So mainly we'll try to identify fault lines, because fault lines are the places where there is a possibility of more event of this disaster, earthquakes. So remote sensing helps us in identifying such kind of fault lines, and based upon it we create something called a seismic hazard maps, where we divide entire area. We have seismic hazard zones of the country, dividing zones into low hazard and the maximum hazard. So based upon such kind of remote sensing inputs, we'll try to create such kind of seismic hazard maps, and this actually also helps us in monitoring the what is the ground deformation before and after the earthquake. So what is the infrastructure before the damage, and what is the infrastructure post the disaster. So usually in earthquakes we see there is a collapse of the buildings, so that kind of assessment we can do with this remote sensing. Then we create this seismic hazard maps. One is to understand which are the zones that are more prone to seismic hazard. So once I know that these are the zones with that particular nature of the seismic thing, then we can also advise that whether we should go with some kind of infrastructure development in that particular location. So what we call as a assist in land use and the infrastructure planning, and also developing of the building codes based upon the seismic hazard maps. So we also make use of the GIS, where actually helps us in identifying the areas which are more vulnerable to this kind of seismic hazard, and when there is a disaster, what is the best route to adopt to provide relief to the people, that we can plan using the GIS models. So mostly we can also assess the damage of the affected areas following the earthquake before and after, and what is the damage in the infrastructure, and supporting the post earthquake recovery and the reconstruction efforts. So in planning all these things, we make use of the remote sensing. If you say, for example, so this is for the Kutch district, where actually we can see the tsunami warning, seismic hazard map, where actually we can see these are the fault lines, and the red color indicates the very high zones which are more prone to seismic thing, and the purple and the light blue are the locations where there is a low possibility of the seismic hazards. So this map is created with then inputs coming from the both the remote sensing and the GIS models. Then we have cyclones. So cyclones, we can detect and monitor the path, because once the cyclone is triggered, with the help of the GIS and remote sensing, we will try to see in which direction it is moving, where actually we will consider the wind parameters and other things to see that how the cyclone pattern is moving. We can track the cyclone situation and inform the current local people that whether it is actually hitting that area or not, and what is the intensity of the flood that is happening and in which direction it is moving. So we can make use of such kind of predictions if you have the models, see that in which direction cyclone is moving. So for detection, monitoring and predicting of the cyclones, we will make use of this technology. Then we create a cyclone hazard map. So UPRAID, this is something like an risk assessment map, where actually we divide the area into different zones, indicating that these are the zones which are more prone to possibility of more prone to cyclones, or these are the areas which are actually less prone to cyclones. So we create a hazard map, cyclone hazard map, identifying the risk and which are the areas that are more vulnerable to cyclones. Then we analyze the population density. So when you say that this is the vulnerable area, so then we will see what is the population that is residing in that area. So we look into population density, what kind of infrastructure that exists in that state, and what are the best evacuation routes. So this is something like a preparedness, mitigation activities. When there is a cyclone thing, so how to rescue the people, what are the best evacuation routes that can be adopted to protect the people, we can plan using the technology. Then we also do the assessment, so pre and the post assessment, I assess the what is the extent of damage that happened because of the cyclone using the technology. Ultimately, the technology helps us in effective cyclone preparedness. So we can also come up with a method how to provide rehabilitation to the people, how to respond to the cyclone, and develop a resilience among the community living in that area. For example, if you see this is the data that is coming from the microwave or the SAR data, where actually the red circle what we see is the pre-disaster condition, pre-cyclone condition, and here we can see post cyclone there is actually inundation of the water. So we can assess actually what is the extent of damage that happened in that particular location, how much area is inundated based upon this pre and post disaster images. Then there is also possibility, as I mentioned, the early warning systems to see that which are the areas that are more prone to such kind of cyclone effect. So there is a study that actually created the vulnerability maps. So this is actually the areas creating the maps, locations which are more vulnerable to such kind of cyclone. Then what are the hazard criteria? So we can define that it is a low, moderate or medium or very high. Then what are the mitigation capacity that can be adapted in that particular area. So these three parameters are taken, and for this actually they provided some kind of weights for each one of them using the analysis hierarchical process, analytical hierarchy process, and then finally they come up with the vulnerability map, hazard map and the mitigation capacity map. So by integrating all these things, they created a risk hazard map, where actually green says the low risk and red shows the high risk map. So this is something a priori we can identify what are the areas that are more prone to such kind of cyclone damage. Tsunami is something what we see, a kind of earthquake that happens within the ocean, and it has a very serious impact. It is a very sudden and has a very high and a serious impact on the coastal areas. So with the help of the technology, we will try to detect the tsunamis and monitor the tsunami triggers. So there are sensors which actually provides us the tsunami triggers. Then we also have the ocean buoyants, the parameters that is collected by special devices in the ocean, and linking these ocean buoyant data with that of the tsunami triggers, we can actually assess what is the extent of the damage that can happen because of the tsunami. And integrating various data layers like coastal topography, what is the altitude, what is the slope of the area, typically what we call as the topography, and what is the population density, that is the population living in that particular area, what kind of infrastructure, and what are the possible routes of the evacuation map. We can create a comprehensive tsunami hazard potential maps and the vulnerability assessments thing. So when you have this kind of tsunami hazard potential maps, we will try to focus more on those areas which are having high risk of the tsunami. So then we can also provide based upon this tsunami trigger data and ocean buoyants, whenever such kind of signals are there, we can alert the community which are actually more prone to such kind of risk of the tsunami. Then we also do the pre and the post tsunami damage assessment, and what are the possible way to provide rehabilitation to the people, and what is the best way to evacuate the people, or what is the recovery rate that happened in the particular area pre and post tsunami, that can be assessed using the technology. This is actually the tsunami hazard potential map for the Kutch district, where actually the red one what we see are the low, why this is the high areas that are more prone to disasters. This is an image of the Nicobar, one of the Nicobar island, the Kutch island. So if you see in 1992, the entire island is intact. This is actually portion where we can see a good mangrove conditions. But then in the 2004, because of the tsunami, we can see that entire this part of the mangroves are lost, and there is a degradation and destruction along the coastal area, where we can see the white color. The red is the forest area, and this blue what we see is the water, white is the sand. Then 2005, then we have 2014, but still there is no recovery after almost a decade. So you can see still the water content is there intruding into the island, and this is the 2023, the current picture, still there is no recovery. So we can make an assessment of that, how the system got damaged, and what is the rate at which there is a restoration that happened in that particular area, but in here there is no restoration. So because now we can see data from 1992 to 2023 at different time stamps, that actually helps us in assessing what is the recovery rate of the resources because of the damage that happened in 2004. Then floods is also one of the important disasters. So based upon the data, we can actually map what is the extent of the damage that happened in a particular area, what is the increase in the water levels. So currently we also have a kind of a model where actually along with the, it's called 4D mapping. So we have space, x and y location too, and we have the timestamp. Now currently we also look into the along with the altitude, the timestamp, that is at what time what is the increase in the water level, that also we can model for a particular area. So the technology helps us in identifying flood extents, then what are the areas that are affected for with these flooding things. So when you have such kind of historical data where frequently the floods are happening, it helps us in creating some kind of an hazard map or the vulnerable map, saying that these are the areas which are actually more prone to such kind of flooding scenarios. So when you know such kind of areas with the high risk of the flooding, we can also plan for the sufficient evacuation programs. So by integrating different data sets, because flooding is typically from the high area to the low area, the flow of the water, topography actually plays a major role. So, if you have the data of the topography, then about the land use, so whether it's areas with the good vegetation, urban areas, soil, that's what typically we have the land use, land cover. So, along with the land use, land cover and what kind of infrastructure and different hydrological models. So, integrating hydrological models with this kind of spatial data sets, we can come up with some kind of a map that actually helps us in understanding what is the scenario that will happen in the particular location when there is an increase in the intensity of the rainfall. So, one drop of rainfall, how actually in which direction it is moving, and finally how there is an accumulation of the water, everything can be analyzed using the GIS models. So, once I know that kind of areas which are actually more prone to, we will come up with what is the best evacuation method and how to rescue the people. So, this typically helps us in monitoring the flood prone areas, enabling early warning and providing. So, I know that these are the areas which are more prone to that risk of floods. So, once there is a heavy rainfall started, that can be intimated to the people to evacuate from that particular area. So, this is for upper Krishna basin, where actually we have this kind of a flood vulnerable map, where we can see the green areas are the very low and the blue areas are resembling the very high potential risk for the flooding scenarios. This is the reset satellite data, and this is the data of the Kashmir, where actually this is during 14th August, where there is no flooding scenarios, and this is during the flooding scenarios of 5th September. So, the black what we see, it is a microwave data. So, the black what we see is the water body. Then this is the during flooding scenario, but later in 5th September, post one day. So, we can see there is a receding of the water. So, such kind of dynamic nature of the water can be monitored using the satellite data. Then we have landslides. Landslides typically are one of the sudden events which are happening when there is a high intensity of the rainfall, or there may be some kind of a earthquake that triggers the landslide. So, the possibility from any side, either from the earthquakes or from the heavy rainfall. So, typically similar to other disasters, we can actually detect and monitor the potential landslide hazard zones. So, integrating different data sets like land use, topography, we will try to create zones that are more prone to landslides, or which are actually safe from the landslide areas. So, by analyzing different features like lithology, lineament, vegetation, cover and slope, because slope plays a major role in the landslide. So, using such kind of data sets, it is a combination of both remote sensing and GIS that actually identify the zones of high risk landslides. So, we can also create a landslide hazard maps indicating that low to the high, and if we know that particular area is more prone to landslides, we will try to avoid planning any kind of infrastructure constructions in those areas. So, for that kind of infrastructure planning, typically we will make use of this landslide hazard map. So, this actual technique also helps us in real time monitoring of the terrain conditions and the soil moisture. So, we actually put some kind of a sensors that actually provides us the data related to what is the soil moisture condition, because soil moisture plays a major role in the landslides. So, whenever there is a heavy rainfall, there is a variation in the soil moisture, and that is actually recorded by the sensor. So, that actually provides us some kind of early warning indicating that okay, in soon there is a possibility of the landslide in a particular area. So, to come with such kind of real time monitoring, we will make use of the terrain conditions, what is the altitude and what is the slope, along with the soil moisture conditions coming from the sensors, and we can indicate that what are the landslide events that can happen in that particular area, and providing a suitable provide early warning and also help in the evacuation programs. So, whenever there is a landslide, again we can also assess what is the extent of the damage that happened because of the landslides by making a comparison of the pre and the post landslide images, identifying what is the extent of the damage that happened in that particular area. So, this is a landslide susceptibility zones, which is actually created using this terrain, lineament, lithology and other methods, where actually the area is categorized. Sikkim is a very high altitude area. So, the green areas are with the low and the red areas are actually more possibility of the high landslide susceptibility. Volcanic eruption is something important. We are actually making use of the thermal data sets and the optical images. We will try to see what is the changes in the area based upon the volcanic eruptions. So, whenever there is a volcanic eruptions, we see the flow of lava as well as the ash deposits and the gases. So, all these things can be monitored using the remote sensing process. So, we can track the what is the volcanic activity by integrating topographic details and the population who are living in that particular vicinity of that area and the physical infrastructures that is available in that particular location. We create a comprehensive volcanic hazard map, providing some kind of warning to the people to be away from such kind of high risk zones, so that in the event of the volcanic activities there is a possibility of the casualties. So, we also monitor the volcanic ash clouds, which pose a significant risk to the aviation and the public health. When there is a volcanic eruption, a lot of soot and ash actually enters into the atmosphere, creating problem to the local people as well as to the aviation. So, by having real time monitoring, we can actually control look into what kind of effect these volcanic ash have a impact. So, we will also do the rapid assessment. Whenever there is an outburst of the volcano, the lava flows and totally damages the surrounding area. So, what is the extent of damage that happened to the population, vegetation or any something living in that particular area, that can be assessed by making use of the pre and the post volcanic images. So, this is actually the volcanic of the barren island, where we can see the red is the lava actually that is flowing. So, at different time stamps we can see the lava as well as the ash that is coming out of that barren volcanic eruptions. So, we can trace actually what is the extent of damage that can happen in that particular area because of the volcanic eruptions. Wildfires are the common in the forest areas that are triggered either by the anthropogenic and the natural conditions. So, typically technique remote sensing technology and GIS we use for detecting and monitoring wildfires. So, identifying the active forest fire areas. So, taking into consideration of different parameters like vegetation, which is one of the best fuel for the triggering the lands forest fires. So, we will try to do the mapping of the vegetation and what is the slope of the area, that also plays a major role. By integrating vegetation, slope and other terrain parameters and other sensor parameters, we will try to create a forest fire risk assessment map, indicating that in the event of forest fires, these are the areas that are more prone to forest fires. So, that such kind of maps are typically help to evacuate the population or protect the population from such kind of forest fire disasters, along with the protection of the wildlife and other infrastructures that is exist in the particular area. So, mostly with the help of the topographic features, vegetation density and other weather parameters, because weather plays a major role in the propagation of the fire behavior. So, we have a fire behavior model that based upon this kind of initial ignition of the forest fire, based upon the wind direction, in which direction there is a movement of the forest fire happen. So, we have this forest fire behavior models that helps us in assessing what is the extent of damage that can happen to the forest and in which direction the forest fire is moving, that can be assessed using the GIS models. So, typically for the effective land management practices and in the post fire assessment to see what is the damage that happened because of the forest fires, we typically make use of this remote sensing technology. So, this is the map forest fire susceptibility in the Garhwal district, where actually we can see the brown are the very high susceptible areas and the blue are the low susceptibility areas. So, these areas are more prone to forest fires regularly. So, this is prepared based upon the historical data sets, and finally, they create this kind of maps that helps in coming with some kind of protection and the land management strategies.